Hey, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating source that asks a pretty tough question. What happens when a good cause gets promoted with, well, bad information? We're going to explore how statistics can be used and maybe sometimes misused to shape what we all believe. Let's get right into it. So, you've probably heard this story before, right? That Super Bowl Sunday isn't just about football. It's supposedly the single most dangerous day of the year for women, with domestic violence rates just exploding. It's a shocking claim, and it's been repeated by news outlets and advocacy groups for years. But what if it's not actually true? And that's really the question at the heart of our source material today. It investigates how, in the fight for a really good cause, these powerful stories can just take on a life of their own, even when the facts don't quite line up. It's that classic case of good intentions versus cold, hard data. To really understand how this happens, the author we're looking at today introduces this really powerful concept that frames her entire argument. She calls it the noble lie. So let's break down exactly what that means. The author kicks things off with this quote from E.M. Forster. And her point is that really powerful emotions, pity, righteous anger, can sometimes cloud our judgment. They can make it harder to just put two and two together. It's the perfect setup for looking at arguments that really pull at our heartstrings, but might not stand up to the evidence. So, what is a noble lie? Well, according to our source, it's basically a falsehood told for what seems like a good reason to raise awareness, to promote a just cause, or to get people to act. But here's the twist. The author's central argument is that these well-meaning lies can actually backfire and end up damaging the very cause they were trying to help. And that brings us right back to that explosive claim about the Super Bowl. The author presents this as a classic textbook case study of a noble lie in action. What's just fascinating here is how fast this story caught fire. I mean, take a look at this timeline from 1993. In just 3 days, this claim went from a single press conference to national TV and major newspapers. It became an accepted fact almost overnight. But then, a Washington Post journalist named Ken Ringel started digging. And here's where the story hits its first huge snag. On one side, you've got the claim, made at the press conference, citing a specific university study. But on the other side, you have what the actual researcher from that university said. And as you can see, they could not be more different. So, Ringel kept pulling on that thread, and the whole story just started to unravel. An expert who is quoted in the press materials, he told Ringel, "I never said that." The reporter who cited the study, she admitted she'd never even seen it. The trail for that 40% number went cold, until finally, one psychologist just conceded to Ringel, "You think maybe we have one of these myth things here?" So what actually happened on the big day? Well, shelters that were monitoring their call volume reported no significant spike at all. And FAIR, the media watchdog group that had helped promote the story, eventually backed away, with a representative admitting the claim should not have gone out. And this quote from one of the psychologists involved, it really captures the author's central concern. The fear here is that when you use these sensational, unproven claims, you risk damaging the credibility of the entire cause. In this case, the very real and serious issue of domestic violence. Okay, so the Super Bowl story is a really dramatic example, but the author argues it isn't just some one-off incident. It actually points to a much bigger issue, a confusing storm of conflicting statistics about domestic violence. So just how big is the problem? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask. If you start looking at reports and advocacy materials, you just get hit with this dizzying array of numbers. I mean, they're all over the place, and it can be completely overwhelming. Just look at this table for a second. In roughly the same time period, you've got estimates ranging from just over 600,000 to over 6 million women assaulted annually. How can all of these numbers coexist? I mean, where does this huge variation even come from? According to our source, the key to untangling this whole mess lies in the work of two social scientists, Richard Gellis and Marie Strauss. Their research gets cited all the time, but the author claims that the most important details often get lost in translation. So here's the crucial point. It's this distinction right here. Gills and Strauss has separated family conflict into two different categories. You have minor violence, like pushing or slapping, and then you have severe violence, actions like kicking or beating up, stuff with a high probability of causing injury. This distinction, the author argues, is everything. And this is the author's explanation for those huge numbers. She claims that by lumping all of these acts, everything from a shove to a severe beating, into one single category called violence or assault, and by focusing only on male perpetrators, that's how you can arrive at those headline-grabbing figures in the millions. Now, for the author's final case study, which examines a piece of history that, a lot like the Super Bowl story, has become a widely repeated fact. I bet a lot of you have heard this one before. The rule of thumb. It's a really chilling story, right? It seems to perfectly capture this brutal patriarchal past. But once again, the author of our source material asks us to take a closer look at the history. So here, the author breaks down the myth versus the actual history. The popular story blames Blackstone's famous codification of English law, but the author claims the phrase rule of thumb isn't even in there. In fact, she says Blackstone actually noted that that kind of violence was prohibited. Instead, she traces the phrase's likely origin to tradesmen, like carpenters, who would literally use their thumbs for rough measurements. So where did this whole legal myth come from? Well, our source traces it to a very specific place, the rulings of two 19th century Southern judges. They alluded to some ancient law about a thumb-sized stick, even while they were ruling against the husbands in their own cases. The author argues it was basically a historical footnote that got misinterpreted and just blown way out of proportion. And all of this brings us to the author's conclusion, which ties all these examples together. The Super Bowl, the conflicting statistics, the rule of thumb, and brings it all back to her central argument. And this quote from the author really brings her whole argument home. Her point is that to create effective public policy, to actually help victims, you need credible, trustworthy information. She contends that using what she calls sensational untruths, even if it's for a good cause, ultimately erodes public trust and makes it even harder to solve the real problem. And that leaves us with the central question of this whole explainer. It's a really tough ethical dilemma, right? In the passionate pursuit of justice, where do we draw the line? When does a noble lie stop being noble and just become a lie? Thanks for joining us.